Hello, everyone. My name is Kristen Hutchinson, Vice President of Education for the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I want to welcome everyone back to our prep conference presentation. This section is part 2, Introduction to Resolutions. Let's go ahead and get started. How does the United Nations present solutions to important global issues? I'll give you a hint. The United Nations does this not through the creation of laws, but through the creation of resolutions. Now, if you have never done our Model UN program before, or if you have done our program before, this part of our workshop is going to be extremely helpful because you'll walk away with a better understanding of what resolutions are and how to start to create them for Model United Nations. So what exactly is a resolution? Well, let's take a look at the word resolution. Do we recognize any words within the word resolution? Well, if you said solution, then you are spot on. A resolution is essentially just a written statement that expresses an opinion or recommends specific solutions or actions be taken on an important issue. Resolutions are presented by one country or a group of countries that share the same ideas. It's important to note that countries may have to compromise in order to create a set of solutions and actions in a resolution that they can all agree upon. Remember back to the Cultural Diplomacy Conference when we talked about the topic of diplomacy and how compromise was an essential skill that diplomats must have. Let's now take a look at a sample resolution. After all, resolutions aren't just written by the United Nations, they're also written by student council, school advisory boards, etc. Our sample resolution for today's workshop deals with the topic of limiting screen time in schools. In fact, for our sample resolution, a group of students at a given school approached their school administration with facts and statistics to show that screen time must be limited in order to not negatively affect a student's social, emotional, and physical growth. You'll notice in this sample resolution that it's broken down into 3 main sections. The first section appears at the very top of the resolution and is the heading. The middle section are the preambulatory clauses, and the final section are the operative clauses. We're going to go through each section so you learn how to create them for the Model United Nations program. Part 1, the heading. A heading identifies the 3 main components of a resolution. Let's take a look at our sample resolution. The committee is the school administration. You can think of a committee kind of like the audience. Who are you writing this resolution to? Who's going to be reading the resolution and making actions upon the resolution? The topic you can think of as the subject matter of the resolution. For this sample, it's actually limiting screen time in schools. And finally, the sponsor of the resolution are the student council members. Sponsors are basically like the authors or the writers of the resolution. Let's now take a look at the second part of resolutions, the preambulatory clauses. Do you recognize any words within the word preambulatory? Well, if you mentioned the prefix pre, you are absolutely correct. Pre means before, and that's exactly what preambulatory clauses do. They discuss background information on a resolution. They discuss why the issue is important, what has already been done, and why the issue is still a problem that we need to focus on and address. Preambulatory clauses need to reference reliable sources. Now, in Model United Nations, you can make use of a host of different reliable sources. In fact, the World Affairs Council gives you a ton of great Model UN resources to use on the website to create your own resolutions. Some of these include the UN Charter, other UN resolutions, or even the Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of the formatting for preambulatory clauses, you're going to want to italicize the first few words at the start of each clause. Each preambulatory clause is then followed by a comma. Let's take a look at our sample resolution. In these preambulatory clauses, you can see that the first word or words is italicized. Each clause ends with a comma, and all of the clauses reference statistics. In fact, for this sample resolution, the student council members used statistics from the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychology. The clauses read, recognizing that 62% of students engage with screens for 4 or more hours a day, acknowledging that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, virtual learning and increased screen time are important to educational opportunities, aware that research shows that too much screen time can affect a student's social, emotional, and physical growth. Now let's take a look at some preambulatory clause phrases. Different phrases have different tones depending on the message you are trying to convey. For example, if you were to write a clause using the phrase observing, it would be much different in tone than using the phrase deeply regretting. You'll have the chance to choose from any of these phrases when you create your own clauses for Model UN. Let's now look at the final part of a resolution, the operative clauses. Look at the word operative. Do you recognize any words or verbs within the word operative? If you said to operate, you are exactly correct. Operative clauses suggest what action should be taken to address the issue at hand. What should we actually do to solve the problem? Operative clauses propose reasonable solutions that the committee and/or UN member countries can enforce. Let's think back to our sample resolution. If the student council members proposed that as an operative clause, the school administration canceled all classes and allowed for 5 days of asynchronous learning, the school administration probably wouldn't be able to enforce that. Each operative clause should directly correspond with the preambulatory clause and in the same order. If that doesn't make a lot of sense right now, don't worry, we're going to get back to that in just a second. In terms of the formatting, the first action word or few words of the operative clauses are underlined. Each operative clause is numbered at the beginning and ends with a semicolon. Finally, the last clause ends with a period. You can basically think of a resolution as a really long run-on sentence. So let's look at these operative clauses and exactly how these solutions were reasonable and enforceable by the school administration. Number 1 calls upon school officials to limit the amount of mandatory screen time for students. Number 2 recommends that the school administration provide students and teachers with the necessary technologies to quickly and effectively learn. And operative clause 3 reads further requests that the school board consider at least 1 day of asynchronous learning per week. I definitely think that these solutions that these students came up with are reasonable and enforceable. Notice for the formatting, each clause starts with a number. The first word or words are underlined. The clause ends in semicolons, with the last clause ending in a period. Once again, here is a list of operative clause vocabulary that you'll be able to choose from. Again, you'll want to choose which phrase you use based on the solution and how strong you want to phrase it. Think about starting a clause with the word notes or encourages versus starting a clause with the words strongly condemns or deplores. Again, you'll be able to choose from this list of vocabulary words when you create your own operative clauses for Model UN. Now, to review, I want to recognize the different types of formatting for the 3 parts of a resolution and the clause correlation. Once again, notice that the header is listed at the top, and it lists the committee, which is the audience, the topic, which is the subject, and the sponsor, which are the authors. The preambulatory clauses follow and they reference statistics from reliable sources, and the operative clauses follow, which propose reasonable solutions that the committee can enforce. What's really important is that the clauses are correlated, which means there's a direct relationship between them. Let's take a look at the first preambulatory clause and the first operative clause. The first clause says, recognizing that 62% of students engage with screens for 4 or more hours per day, the solution to this can be found in operative clause number 1, calls upon school officials to limit the amount of mandatory screen time for students. If you were to read the second preambulatory clause and the second operative clause, or the third preambulatory clause and the third operative clause, you'd also notice that there is a direct correlation between the clauses in terms of how they are numbered and how they appear in the resolution. Okay, with that, we are done with part 2 of our preparatory conference workshop, Introduction to Resolutions.